a while ago, when I presented a paper on the developmental model of China and the economic imbalance of China, after the presentation, an academic friend of mine who is a global political economist and he's low China specialist. So he come to me, ask a question that he's not a Chinese specialist and it is in private, so he can use some strong words. And he's puzzled by following the news about the US-China currency dispute, and he finds that both US and China is quite schizophrenic because he couldn't understand why US has been pushing China to reevaluate the yuan, but at the same time US in action is not quite using all the means available to push China to reevaluate. So what does US want? Compared to Japan in the 1980s, then when US is really want Japan to reevaluate the yen, then it really used a lot of arms twisting instruments, and so the Plaza Accord in 1985 and things like that. But compared to today with China, of course US has less leverage over China vis-a-vis with Japan when the Cold War is still around. But he still can understand why there's kind of a tough talk but little action. And from the China side, he also finds puzzle that it seems that the Chinese government keeps saying that, yeah, we are reevaluating, but not so fast. And in reality, it is not quite reevaluating as fast as it should be. And for example, as many journalists and many observers, so there's kind of they are talking, but the action doesn't quite match, and the quarrel actually has a pattern that sometimes it peaks and sometimes it becomes silent again. So what do they want? And both governments and recently there are some quite good reports and scholarly research coming out to look at the difficulties of both China and US governments in terms of the political economy of currency. That because there's different vested interest groups in both countries, that different interest groups have different takes on the currency issue. For example, in the US, financial sectors tend to actually prefer strong dollars, while the enterprise and farmers that export or feared competition from imports prefer a weak dollar, so they, like in the Midwest, many corn farmers and soybean farmers and that export farm products, and also Caterpillar that export earth digging machines to China. They want a weaker yuan. So there's different groups competing for attention from the government. And on the side of China as well, that many people already point out that the export sectors in China, of course, would favor a kind of a continuous devaluation yuan, and they are opposed to rapid or any appreciation, while the domestic-oriented manufacturers and sectors that import foreign components and raw materials and sell domestically, that they actually favor appreciation of yuan, then they become more competitive in the local market, and so on and so on. So there's this kind of a political economy. Different interest groups have different takes, so the government sometimes anything this group and sometimes anything that group, so is why the fascination and the schizophrenia. What I'm trying to argue now is that it is right that there's different interest groups. But even if we assume that both the policymakers in China and in US are the kind of philosopher kings who just care about the long-term and stability and long-term growth of the economy and are deaf to their vested interests, they are still very much stuck in a dilemma that whether to appreciate or not from the China perspective, or whether to push hard for appreciation or not from the US perspective. So because these dilemmas is not just about different vested interest groups, but it's structural, built into the very model of development and economic reproduction in both China and the US. For example, from the US perspective, what the US government need to do right now is a number of things, and these number of things are contradictory in many ways, and it lead to contradictory disposition towards the currency issue with China. For example, first of all, the US government need to think hard about how to finance the exploding fiscal deficit, and the solution that is very well known is that to ask Chinese government to buy more US Treasury bonds. Of course, the best solution is to shrink the deficit, but politically it becomes more and more difficult. So when the deficits keep exploding, it leads China to buy more and more U.S. Treasury bonds. And in that case, then U.S. have to tolerate devaluated or continuous long appreciation of the yuan, because actually buying Treasury bond is exactly the means for which the Chinese government devalued the yuan, by buying the U.S. Treasury bond. So if the U.S. need to secure Chinese government keep buying U.S. Treasury bonds to finance the fiscal deficit, then it has to tolerate the devalued yuan. At the same time, the U.S. also need to worry about the status of dollar as a kind of a default reserve currency, and the credibility and the world investors and governments' confidence in the dollar. So U.S. also very much anxious about shrinking the current account deficit. In that sense, that U.S. At least many policymakers and commentators and advisors would think that the yuan appreciation would be a positive factor in helping U.S. to shrink the current account deficit, to close the trade gap between U.S. and China. But in that case, then you will require China to dump or at least reduce the purchase of U.S. Treasury bonds. And of course, Paul Krugman would think that it is not an issue, as in 2010, in January 1st or 2nd, his first column of the year, which is called the Chinese New Year in New York Times, and he said that if the Chinese government dump U.S. Treasury bonds, the U.S. government should send them a thank you note, because at the moment that they dump the U.S. Treasury bonds, it means that it is appreciation of the yuan. Because one of the key mechanisms of the Chinese government to keep the yuan low is to keep buying Treasury bonds. And once they dump it, then the yuan will appreciate with respect to U.S. dollar. And then, of course, then you will say, oh, then what about the fiscal deficit? And then the fiscal deficit will not be financed. And then Paul Krugman will think that it is not an issue, because we don't need to worry about inflation. And we can finance the fiscal deficit by asking the Fed to print more money through quantitative easing to buy those bonds. So it can be financed this way. So he's on the school of that. We don't need to worry about the fiscal deficit, and we don't worry about inflation. We don't worry about Chinese stop financing U.S. So let the Chinese, or even provoke the Chinese to dump the U.S. Treasury bond. It is good for closing the current account deficit of the U.S. So it is these two competing consideration. But of course, that Paul Krugman is just Paul Krugman. Not everybody believes in him. Many people still worry about inflation. Many people still worry about how to finance the fiscal deficit. So these two considerations are contradictory. That if you want to continue the secure the financing of fiscal deficit, then U.S. has to tolerate the low yuan. And if U.S. really want to fix the current account deficit, then it has to put more pressure. So what I see is that the U.S. government is kind of vacillating between these two considerations regarding the long-term health of the economy. And from the Chinese side, there is also a structural dilemmas as well. It is very well known that China has been export dependent, though that recently there's a lot of work saying that actually China is not that export dependent, and there's some truism in it that Professor Loudon also mentioned that, for example, a computer made in export in China is not all the values, and even not most of the values of that computer is generated within China, but most of the value are generated from the components that the assembler, the import from other Asian countries and so on and so. But to take an overall picture, that if export as a percentage of GDP is not a good indicator of how dependent China's economy is on export, if we look at another indicator like the trade surplus as a percentage of GDP, we will find that actually China is still quite driven by export. For example, right before 2008, the financial crisis, the trade surplus of China as a percentage of GDP is about 7.7%. It is not a big number, but if you compare with Japan and compare with West Germany and then Germany throughout the post-war period, their trade surplus as a percentage of GDP level exceeds 5%, and Japan is always in 2 or 3%. But it is standard knowledge that their economy is very much driven by export over the post-war period. So if you think that 7.7% as a trade surplus as a percentage of GDP of China is not showing that China is dependent or driven by export, then you have to also accept a very counterintuitive knowledge or conclusion that Japan and West Germany and then Germany is never driven by export, then it is kind of difficult to digest. And so export is important for China. And then also we explain why the leadership is so worried about after the financial crisis, and so much so that they have to pull up the fiscal stimulus to make up the slack created by the collapse of the export sector at the turn of the 2009. So one argument is that an appreciated yuan will be good for China in the long term for the rebalancing, because it will shrink the importance of the export sector to make them suffer. And then it will benefit the domestic private consumption, because all kind of products domestically made with foreign components will become more price competitive, and it will cheaper to consumers if the yuan appreciates. So it is good for the in the long run. But I'm sure that it is good for in the long run, but at the same time, because China has been so dependent on export, and actually it is not the whole story. That we know that after 2008, 2009, after the export sector got into trouble, China stimulated the economy back to a robust growth in 2009, 2010, and it is an investment story. And then we can take a look at, I don't have time to go over all the slides, but for example, this one. You can see that here is the cursor. The solid line is the household consumption, private consumption as a share of GDP. Basically, it continued to drop. It flattened a little bit until 2008, 2009, but it is not picking up much, though in absolute amount consumption is growing, but because the GDP is always growing at a much faster general rate than consumption, then the percentage keeps falling. So what happened in 2008 and 2009 is that after 2008, the export kind of tanked, but not so bad actually. It's just go back to an earlier level, and the investment pick up the slack by becoming more important in the economy. And the investment, and as many of our panelists and panelists in the next section would point out, that is driven by lax lending of state banks and liquidity. And actually, in that regard, the export is also very important to the investment, because the trade surplus actually accounts for quite a large part of as a large part of the source of the liquidity. How it works is that with a kind of a packed or quasi-packed or undervalued yuan vis-a-vis the dollar, when exporters export the stuff and earn US dollar, they don't open a US dollar account in China and put it in. They have to submit the dollar to the state bank and then exchange it into, if the yuan value is low, then they can exchange back into a large amount of yuan, and then the exporters will deposit the yuan in the bank, and then bank will become awash with this little deposit and then lend it, or that entrepreneurs will use this yuan to invest himself or herself in real estate and many other things, and part of it, of course, will become a salary of its employees and things like that. So so it is why some people think that to curb the liquidity or excess liquidity of China, that appreciation will help, because after the appreciation, then you earn the same amount of US dollars in your export, and then when you exchange it into yuan, you get a small amount of yuan, and then to deposit in the bank to invest. So there's a less liquidity available in the system, and it will be less inflation and less asset bubble. But it is an ideal situation. It is not the case right now, so you can see that how big the scale or how big the contribution of this trade surplus and export is to the availability of liquidity. Let me shift back a little bit to a table. It is here. Just focus on the top part, that the upper part, that the current account balance, which is mostly trade balance actually. in 2008 is, in terms of yuan, is 2.97 trillion yuan. And then the total new lending in 2009, we already know that it is a kind of a historic peak because of the stimulus, is 9.6 trillion yuan. So that the trade balance or the current account balance and the liquidity that it generates, it is a rough estimation. Of course, there's a lot of other channel that the money will go, but to give you a sense of the scale in comparison, that is 1/3 of the size of the new lending in 2009, which is already very big. So this kind of a trade balance and current account, the trade surplus and current account surplus that originate from the export business in China has been one of the sources of the liquidity that fueled the lending boom and then the investment-driven recovery. So it has been very important. Both the export sector is important in itself and also in its contribution to the availability of liquidity in the economy. So the dilemma of the Chinese leadership is that if it really appreciates the yuan, of course it can curb the excess liquidity and then it can shrink the export sectors. But at the same time, because the economy is already so entrenched in this investment and export-oriented model, then before it generates the benefits of lifting the domestic consumption, it might probably cause more harms before it generates the benefits. That is because it will cause jobs in the export sector and also the investment sector as well. In light of the fact that in 2012 there's a leadership transition, and I don't think anybody will be very bold enough to take this risk to appreciate the yuan. And at the same time, though appreciation of the yuan will contribute to the rebalancing of the Chinese economy to a more private consumption-driven growth, but it cannot be the whole story, because basically one of the origins that I don't have time to detail here, one of the origins of the export competitiveness and the low private consumption is the low wage level of China in comparison with the overall GDP. And then probably the last graph I'm going to show you is this. This wage as a percentage of GDP has been dropping, and the private consumption as a percentage of GDP has been dropping, while profits as a percentage of GDP is dropping. So it is a distribution issue. So even if you appreciate the yuan, it will help with balancing, but it is not going to make the whole thing or complete the process without the kind of a fundamental redistribution, restructuration of the economy. So without the kind of this redistribution, appreciation of the yuan is not going to be balancing the economy and only cause jobs in the export sectors and in the investment sector. So it will do more harm than good in the short run. So my prediction is that the Chinese leadership will be continue to pay lip service to appreciate the yuan, but continue to keep it low. At the same time, that for the U.S. side, that actually it's not the last graph. This is the last graph that I'm going to show you. I'm going to explain all of it, but just at the tail of it, you can see that after the financial crisis, surprisingly, that the current account deficit of U.S. actually improved quite a bit, and then there's a fear of collapse of the dollar in the beginning of the crisis, but actually because of the euro troubles, that it became, and the dollars, interestingly, became a safe haven of people who sell the euro. And when the North Korean bombing South Korea and things like that, there's also the observation that many money in Asia also free to the U.S. So the collapse of the dollar fear is subsided, and also the current account deficit not that big an issue now. So the bigger issue now is to finance the fiscal deficit of the U.S. So that my prediction, another prediction, that the U.S. government, while keep talking about pushing pressure on China to appreciate, will not be that serious and it is in the short run. So in conclusion, what I will foresee in the short run is that short to medium run is that there will be kind of a period of business as usual, that China continue to export and invest and continue to keep the yuan low, and then U.S. will be just talking about putting pressure on China, but at the same time not doing much real action to pushing up the yuan. And it is human behavior. In full world history, we see that there's a business as usual, a crisis hit, people try to change, and if the crisis is contained, people will go on the same business for another period until a bigger crisis hit. Maybe it will change the picture. Thank you.